The first time I heard the words, they didn't feel real. This child is not yours. For a moment, the world around me seemed to lose its shape. The walls blurred, the air turned heavy inside my lungs, and somewhere deep in my chest, something cracked with a sound only I could hear. This story isn't about heartbreak alone. It's about betrayal so deep it tears apart the life you spent decades building. The kind of betrayal that hides behind polished smiles, elegant dinners, and whispered promises in the dark. My name is Jared Atkinson. I'm 38 years old, owner of the largest construction company in Cedar Falls. But I didn't start at the top. I started with blistered hands, steel-toed boots, and enough debt to drown a man twice my size. At 18, I hauled concrete under scorching summer heat for barely enough money to survive. I worked through freezing winters, climbed scaffolding in storms, and learned quickly that nobody hands struggling men second chances. Every dollar I earned came from exhaustion, discipline, and sacrifice. 15 years later, Atkinson Construction employed more than 200 workers across 3 states. We handled multi-million-dollar commercial projects, luxury developments, and government contracts. People in Cedar Falls called me a success story. Some even called me the embodiment of the American dream. But none of that meant anything compared to my family. Or at least, the family I thought I had. I married Angela Moody when she was 20 and I was 23. She was beautiful in the effortless way that turned heads without trying. Blonde hair, sharp blue eyes, graceful posture. The daughter of Cedar Falls' former mayor, raised among old money traditions and country club politics. The Moody fortune had faded years before I met her, but Angela still carried herself like royalty. She knew how to host elegant dinners, charm wealthy investors, and smile perfectly beside me during charity galas. Together, we looked untouchable. Then Trevor came into our lives. Our son was the best thing that ever happened to me. At 14, he already had my stubborn determination and Angela's intelligence. He excelled in baseball, dominated his classes, and somehow managed to remain humble despite growing up surrounded by wealth. Every weekend, Trevor and I disappeared into the garage together. We built birdhouses, shelves, tables, anything we could dream up with wood, tools, and patience. Those afternoons became sacred to me. Sawdust in the air. Classic rock playing softly from an old radio. My son laughing while trying to use tools too big for his hands. Meanwhile, Angela slowly drifted away from those moments. She was always busy. Charity events, brunches, social gatherings, shopping trips that lasted entire afternoons. I noticed the distance, but marriage changes over time. Or at least that's what I told myself. Then, 6 months ago, Angela announced she was pregnant. After years of devastating miscarriages, the news should have felt like a miracle. Instead, it felt wrong. The moment she told me, something inside me tightened. Angela didn't glow with joy the way I expected. She looked nervous, fragile, almost frightened. As the pregnancy progressed, she changed even more. She stopped involving me in doctor appointments unless absolutely necessary. She disappeared for hours with vague explanations that never made sense. Sometimes she claimed she'd gone shopping, but returned empty-handed. Other times, she said she visited her sister Muriel, yet smelled faintly of expensive hotel perfume instead of home cooking and cigarettes. And then there were the phone calls. She guarded her phone like it contained state secrets. Late at night, I'd catch the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes while she smiled at messages she quickly hid whenever I entered the room. One Friday evening, my business partner and lifelong friend, Chuck Lake, leaned against the bar beside me and lowered his voice carefully. Man, something's off with Angela. I frowned. What do you mean? Sarah saw her downtown last week, at a cafe. She was with some guy nobody recognized. Chuck hesitated before continuing. They looked close. I immediately defended her. Pregnancy hormones, stress, anxiety after the miscarriages. That was the explanation I chose because it was easier than facing the alternative. But deep down, suspicion had already planted its roots. The morning of the ultrasound appointment felt strangely cold despite the warm spring air outside. Angela barely touched her breakfast. Her hands trembled around her coffee mug, and she checked herself repeatedly in the kitchen window reflection, as if searching for cracks in the mask she wore. I tried to lighten the mood. After the appointment, let's celebrate. Lunch downtown? She forced a weak smile without looking at me. Sure. The silence between us during the drive felt unbearable. Dr. Edmund Harrington had treated our family for more than a decade. He was respected throughout Cedar Falls, a calm, silver-haired physician whose gentle voice reassured frightened parents and grieving families alike. He had guided us through every miscarriage with compassion and patience. I trusted him completely. While Angela underwent the scan, I sat in the waiting room reviewing emails about our newest hotel development project. It was the biggest contract of my career, a project that could expand my company across the entire region. Then, Dr. Harrington stepped into the hallway. And immediately, I knew something was terribly wrong. His face had gone pale. His normally steady hands trembled slightly at his sides. Jared, could you come into my office for a moment? The moment the door closed behind us, the air changed. Dr. Harrington paced once before finally speaking. What I'm about to tell you is extremely difficult. My stomach tightened. The baby's developmental measurements don't match the conception timeline Angela provided. I stared at him blankly. I don't understand. He swallowed carefully. The fetus appears approximately 3 weeks older than expected. Based on all measurements, conception occurred around 26 weeks ago, not 23. The words crashed into me slowly, like a distant explosion finally reaching shore. I felt my voice crack. What exactly are you saying? Dr. Harrington met my eyes with visible pain. Jared, during that time frame, according to your records and your travel schedule, you were in Denver. Denver. The memory hit instantly. 3 straight weeks overseeing our largest construction project. 18-hour workdays, hotel rooms, exhaustion, long nightly phone calls with Angela while counting the days until I returned home. I whispered the question even though part of me already knew the answer. Are you sure? He nodded once. I checked the calculations multiple times. There's no mistake. The room tilted. 15 years of marriage suddenly rearranged themselves into something ugly and unrecognizable. The secretive phone calls, the distance, the unexplained disappearances, the nervous behavior. Every warning sign I ignored now stood before me in perfect clarity. Dr. Harrington slowly turned the monitor toward me. There it was. Cold medical evidence glowing on the screen. Measurements, growth charts, dates, truth. The child growing inside Angela could not possibly be mine. When we returned to the examination room, Angela was already crying. Not confused, not shocked, guilty. She knew. The moment our eyes met, I saw it written across her face. Jared, please, she whispered weakly. Let me explain. Something inside me froze solid. No, I said quietly. You don't get to explain this away. I looked at the ultrasound one final time before turning back toward her. We're going home. My voice sounded terrifyingly calm even to myself. And then you're going to tell me everything. That night, instead of screaming or destroying the house in rage, I did something far more dangerous. I became strategic. I had built my company through patience, planning, and precision. Emotion never guided my decisions during negotiations, lawsuits, or business expansions. Why should it now? The moment Angela fell asleep, I opened my laptop and began searching. The first name I investigated was Marcos Jennings. Within minutes, I found him. CEO of Jennings Development Group, luxury real estate developer, photogenic smile, tailored suits, expensive watches, public charity donor, social media filled with yachts, wine tastings, and motivational nonsense about visionary leadership, the kind of man who looked polished on the outside while rotting underneath. Digging deeper, I discovered he was married to Samantha Jennings, a successful attorney in the state capitol. They had twin daughters and lived in a mansion worth several $1,000,000. My blood turned cold. This man wasn't just destroying my family. He was destroying his own, too. Over the next week, I transformed into someone Angela would no longer recognize. Outwardly, I remained calm, predictable, controlled. Privately, I prepared for war. I hired Paul Hines, a former detective with a reputation for handling infidelity investigations discreetly and thoroughly. 3 days later, Paul handed me a folder thick enough to destroy lives. Photographs, hotel receipts, financial records, messages. Angela and Marcos had been meeting twice a week for 8 months at the Grand View Hotel. 8 months. While I worked myself to exhaustion building our future, my wife had been using our joint bank account to fund hotel suites for another man. But the betrayal ran even deeper. Paul uncovered plans, detailed plans. Angela intended to file for divorce shortly after the baby's birth. She and Marcos had already researched luxury penthouses downtown. They discussed private schools for their future family. They planned to use Connecticut divorce laws to take half of everything I had spent 15 years building. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't passion. It was calculated destruction. And somehow, that realization hurt even more than the affair itself. Still, I kept smiling at breakfast. Still, I kissed Trevor on the forehead before school. Still, I watched Angela discuss nursery paint colors while secretly preparing to erase me from her life. That was the moment my love for her finally died. Not in the doctor's office, not during the investigation, but watching her lie so effortlessly while pretending to be a devoted wife. Then Paul uncovered something even bigger. Marcos Jennings wasn't merely immoral, he was corrupt. Fraudulent environmental permits, safety violations, bribed inspectors, tax fraud, illegal financial transfers. During a staged business meeting, I allowed Marcos to brag himself straight into destruction. He spoke arrogantly, convinced I was just another contractor impressed by his wealth. "I've learned regulations are flexible if you know the right people," he said with a smug grin. I smiled back while secretly recording every word. From that moment forward, the outcome became inevitable. I contacted federal agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the IRS, state investigators. Then I contacted Samantha Jennings. She deserved the truth before the explosion began. We met in a quiet coffee shop near her office. I placed the evidence in front of her one piece at a time. Photographs, hotel receipts, messages, the ultrasound report. Samantha remained composed, but I could see devastation burning behind her eyes. When she finally looked up at me, her voice had turned razor sharp. "He planned to abandon our daughters for this?" "Yes." A long silence followed. Then Samantha closed the folder carefully. "Not if I destroy him first." Together, we coordinated everything with frightening precision. By Monday morning, the trap closed. Federal agents raided Marcos's offices before sunrise. His accounts were frozen. Investors fled. Samantha filed for divorce immediately. News outlets exposed environmental crimes tied to his developments. Within 24 hours, the empire Marcos built began collapsing publicly and violently. Angela watched it happen in complete horror. The luxury future she imagined vanished overnight. When she finally reached Marcos by phone, he sounded panicked and broken. "Everything's gone," he reportedly told her. "The government seized everything." And for the first time, Angela understood exactly what I had done. Not out of blind rage, but with patience, precision, and absolute finality. The aftermath reshaped every life involved. Marcos received 7 years in federal prison for fraud, environmental crimes, and embezzlement. His company collapsed into bankruptcy. Angela gave birth alone that winter to a daughter named Cora, while the child's father sat behind bars. Because of the infidelity clause hidden inside our prenuptial agreement, Angela lost nearly everything she expected to take from me. The woman who once hosted glamorous charity galas now worked part-time at a grocery store, while struggling to rebuild her life from scratch. Trevor and I survived the storm together. Some nights, I caught sadness in his eyes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. But we became closer than ever before. We spent weekends hiking wooded trails around Cedar Falls, building furniture in the garage, and slowly rebuilding our lives on something far stronger than appearances: truth. 3 years later, my company has doubled in size. Atkinson Construction now employs more than 400 workers across multiple states. And eventually, after all the destruction faded into memory, I found love again. Her name is Pearl Downing, a widow with kind eyes and quiet strength. Unlike the relationship I once had with Angela, nothing between us is built on image or performance. We built our connections slowly, carefully, honestly. That made all the difference. Sometimes I still think about the ultrasound room, about the exact second my old life shattered forever. But strangely, I no longer see that moment as the end of something beautiful. I see it as the beginning of truth, because foundations matter. I learned that in construction long before I learned it in marriage. A building raised on weak ground will eventually collapse, no matter how beautiful it appears from the outside. And my old life was built on sand. Now, finally, my life stands on bedrock. Years later, there were still nights when sleep refused to come. Not because I missed Angela. That version of my life was long dead. But betrayal leaves echoes behind, quiet ones, the kind that crawl into your thoughts at 2 a.m. when the house is dark and the world finally goes silent. Sometimes I'd wake up and walk downstairs barefoot, pouring myself black coffee while staring through the kitchen windows at the distant lights of Cedar Falls. The town looked peaceful from up on Maple Ridge. Clean streets, quiet neighborhoods, church steeples glowing beneath the moonlight. People passing through would never imagine how many secrets hid behind those polished front doors. One winter evening, nearly 4 years after the divorce, Trevor came home unusually quiet. He dropped his backpack near the stairs and headed straight for the garage without saying much. That alone caught my attention. Normally, he'd talk non-stop about baseball practice, school drama, or whatever project he wanted us to build next. I found him sitting alone at the old wooden workbench, staring at a half-finished cedar shelf we'd been building together. The garage smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Snow tapped softly against the windows, while an old country song played low from the radio. "You okay, buddy?" I asked carefully. Trevor kept his eyes on the shelf. "I saw Mom today." I leaned silently against the workbench. She came to my game. That surprised me. Angela rarely attended public events anymore. Cedar Falls had a long memory, and the scandal surrounding her divorce became the kind of story people whispered about for years. "How was she?" I asked. Trevor hesitated. "Tired." Something about the way he said it twisted inside my chest. No matter what Angela had done to me, she was still his mother. "She wanted to talk after the game," he continued quietly. "Said she misses how things used to be." I stayed silent. Trevor finally looked at me. "She cries a lot now." The anger I once carried toward Angela had cooled over the years into something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but perspective. Pain changes people. Consequences change them even more. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Trevor shrugged. I didn't know what to say. I walked over and sat beside him. "You don't have to fix grown-up mistakes," I told him softly. "That's not your job." His jaw tightened slightly, fighting emotions teenage boys often try to hide. "Do you hate her?" The question hung heavily between us. I thought carefully before answering. "There was a time when I did," I admitted. "But hate keeps wounds alive longer than they deserve." Trevor looked down at his hands. "She said she ruined everything." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I sighed. "Your mother made terrible choices. Choices that hurt a lot of people. But that doesn't erase every good thing she ever did." Trevor nodded slowly, though I could tell he was still trying to untangle feelings far too heavy for someone his age. Then he asked the question I'd secretly feared for years. "Did you ever want revenge more than justice?" The garage suddenly felt colder. I stared at the scattered tools across the workbench while memories flooded back. The rage, the humiliation, the obsessive planning, the satisfaction I felt watching Marcos lose everything, and the terrifying realization of how easy it had become to destroy another human being once I stopped seeing them as human. "Yes," I answered honestly. Trevor's eyes lifted toward mine. There were moments I wanted them to suffer exactly the way I suffered. "Then why didn't you?" I gave a small, humorless smile. "Oh, I did make them suffer." The words lingered heavily in the air. But eventually I realized something important. I leaned back in the chair slowly. Revenge feels powerful in the beginning, almost addictive. But if you stay inside it too long, it starts turning you into someone unrecognizable. Trevor listened carefully. "I exposed the truth," I continued. "I protected our family. I defended what I built. But there were nights afterward when I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back." Outside, snow continued falling in soft, white sheets beneath the streetlights. "I don't regret what I did," I said quietly. "But I learned there's a fine line between justice and becoming consumed by destruction." Trevor absorbed every word. Then, after a long silence, he finally asked the question that mattered most. "Are you happy now?" That one was easy. I smiled for real this time. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." And for the first time in years, I realized it was completely true. Not because my enemies lost, not because Angela suffered consequences, not because Marcos ended up in prison, but because I survived becoming bitter. That was the real victory. Later that night, after Trevor went upstairs, I remained alone in the garage finishing the cedar shelf we'd started together weeks earlier. The scent of fresh-cut wood filled the room as I sanded the edges smooth beneath warm, overhead lights. Simple work. Honest work. The kind that clears your mind. Around midnight, my phone buzzed on the table nearby. A text from Pearl. "Still awake, stubborn man?" I smiled immediately. "Finishing a project with Trevor." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "You deserve this life, Jared. Don't forget that." I stared at the screen longer than necessary. For years after the betrayal, I secretly believed happiness had become something temporary, fragile, dangerous, like trusting ice that might crack beneath your feet at any moment. But Pearl changed that, slowly. Not through dramatic declarations, through consistency, through honesty, through small, everyday moments that proved love didn't have to feel like performance. I finally turned off the garage lights and headed inside. Before going upstairs, I stopped briefly at the large living room windows overlooking Cedar Falls below. Snow blanketed the streets peacefully. Somewhere out there, Angela was probably finishing another late shift at the grocery store before returning to her small apartment and quiet life. Somewhere else, Marcos sat inside a prison cell thinking about the empire he destroyed with arrogance and greed. And here I stood, still breathing, still building, still moving forward. The strange thing about devastation is that people assume it destroys you completely. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it strips away every illusion until only truth remains. And if you're strong enough to survive what comes after that, you finally become the person you were supposed to be all along. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snow melted from the hills surrounding Cedar Falls, leaving behind muddy roads, cold morning fog, and the earthy smell of wet pine drifting through town. Construction season returned in full force, and with it came the controlled chaos I'd always loved. Engines roaring before sunrise, steel beams swinging through the air, crews shouting measurements over the sound of machinery. Work had always been the one place where my mind stayed clear. Concrete either held or it cracked. Foundations were either solid or they failed. There was comfort in that honesty. One Thursday afternoon, I stood on the 23rd floor of a new luxury hotel project overlooking the river when Chuck walked toward me with an expression I immediately recognized. "Got a minute?" he asked carefully. I wiped dust from my hands and nodded. We stepped away from the crew toward the unfinished balcony where cold wind whipped through exposed steel framing. Chuck shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "Angela came by the office yesterday." That caught me off guard. "She what?" "She wanted to talk to you." I stared out across Cedar Falls silently. "She looked rough, man." I said nothing. Chuck hesitated before continuing. "I guess things have gotten harder for her lately. Cora's been sick a lot. Medical bills piling up. Angela's working double shifts." A dull ache settled somewhere deep in my chest despite myself. I hadn't seen Angela in nearly 8 months outside of brief exchanges during Trevor-related events. "How bad?" I finally asked. Chuck exhaled slowly. "Bad enough that she swallowed her pride and asked me where she could find you." The younger version of me, the furious man from years ago, would have felt satisfaction hearing that. But age changes certain emotions. Pain loses its fire eventually. What remains afterward is usually sadness. "I'll think about it," I muttered. That evening, I couldn't focus on anything. Pearl noticed immediately. We were sitting on the back patio watching sunset spill gold across the trees behind the house when she quietly asked, "What's going on in that head of yours?" I told her everything. About Chuck, about Angela, about Cora being sick. Pearl listened without interrupting, curled beneath a blanket with a cup of tea warming her hands. When I finished, she stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she asked softly, "Do you still love her?" The question hit harder than expected. I looked out toward the fading sunlight before answering honestly. "No," I said. "Not the way I used to." "But?" I rubbed a hand across my jaw slowly. "But part of me will probably always care what happens to her." Pearl nodded gently, unsurprised. "That doesn't make you weak, Jared." Maybe not. But it made things complicated. 3 days later, I finally agreed to meet Angela. Not at the old house. Not somewhere personal. A small diner outside town where nobody paid attention to other people's business. When I walked inside, I almost didn't recognize her. The Angela I remembered had always looked polished, perfect hair, designer clothes, makeup flawless even on lazy Sundays. The woman sitting in the corner booth now looked exhausted. Her blonde hair was shorter and darker at the roots. Fine lines framed her eyes. Her posture carried the weight of years that had clearly not been kind. And yet, for the first time in a very long time, she looked real. No mask, no performance, just a tired woman trying to survive the consequences of her own choices. She stood awkwardly when she saw me. "Hi, Jared." Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I slid into the booth across from her. "You said it was important." Angela nodded quickly. "It is." For several seconds she struggled to speak. Then finally, The words spilled out. Cora has a heart condition. The sentence hit me like cold water. She needs surgery. I leaned back slowly. Angela's eyes filled immediately with tears she clearly hated showing. I've been trying to handle everything myself, but insurance barely covers half of it, and... Her voice cracked. I don't know what to do anymore. A waitress approached awkwardly, sensed the tension instantly, and quietly retreated after taking our coffee order. I studied Angela carefully. Years ago, I would have questioned whether this was manipulation. Now, I saw something different. Defeat, not theatrical sorrow, real exhaustion. How serious is it? I asked quietly. Angela swallowed hard. The doctors say she'll be okay if they operate soon. If. That single word hung heavily between us. She lowered her eyes. I know I have no right asking you for anything. No argument there. But I'm asking anyway. The diner fell silent around us, except for distant dishes clattering behind the counter. Finally, Angela looked up at me again, and for the first time since our marriage collapsed, I saw complete honesty in her eyes. I destroyed our family, she whispered. I destroyed my own life, I know that. Tears slid down her cheeks unchecked now. I was selfish and arrogant and stupid. I thought I deserved excitement, luxury, escape. She shook her head bitterly. I thought consequences were things that happened to other people. I stayed silent. Angela laughed weakly through tears. You know what the worst part is? What? I spent years pretending to be someone important. Her voice trembled. But losing everything was the first time I ever actually learned how to be human. The words landed harder than I expected, because I believed her. No manipulation, no lies, just truth stripped raw. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she continued quietly. I don't think I deserve that. But Cora... Her face crumpled completely. She's innocent, Jared. And there it was. The one thing capable of breaking through the last walls inside me, an innocent child. A little girl born from betrayal who never asked to carry the consequences of adult sins. I looked down at my untouched coffee for a very long time, then finally asked, How much? Angela blinked in shock. Jared. How much does the surgery cost? Fresh tears flooded her eyes instantly. When she answered, her voice barely worked. Almost 80,000. I nodded once slowly. I'll take care of it. Angela covered her mouth as sobs escaped before she could stop them. Why? She whispered brokenly. After everything I did to you, why would you help me? I looked at her calmly across the table. I'm not doing it for you. Her shoulders shook as she cried harder. I know. And strangely enough, that was the moment I finally became free of her. Not during the divorce, not during Marcos's downfall, not when I rebuilt my life. Here, in that quiet diner, because hatred had finally lost its grip completely. Weeks later, I sat beside Trevor in a hospital waiting room while surgeons operated on little Cora upstairs. The child had Angela's eyes, but otherwise she looked painfully ordinary. Small, fragile, innocent. Trevor had insisted on coming. She's still my sister, he said simply. That sentence alone told me I'd done at least one thing right as a father. Hours later, the surgeon finally emerged, smiling beneath his mask. The operation was successful. Angela collapsed into tears of relief so intense she nearly fell over. And as I watched her crying in that hospital hallway, I realized something unexpected. Life had punished her far more thoroughly than I ever could have. Not through poverty, not through shame, but through understanding. True understanding of what she destroyed. Sometimes that becomes the heaviest punishment of all. Later that night, after Trevor and Angela visited Cora's recovery room, I stepped outside the hospital alone. The spring air smelled of rain and fresh asphalt. Pearl called a few minutes later. "How did it go?" I looked up at the dark sky above Cedar Falls. "She's going to be okay." Pearl smiled softly through the phone. "And how are you?" I thought about that carefully. For years, I believed strength meant crushing people who betrayed you. Then later, I believed strength meant surviving them. But standing there outside the hospital, I finally understood something deeper. Real strength is being handed every reason to become cruel and choosing not to. "I'm good," I answered quietly, and this time there wasn't even a shadow of anger left inside me anymore. The summer after Cora's surgery became one of the quietest and strangely most meaningful seasons of my life. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because, for the first time in years, there was no war left to fight. No investigations, no lawyers, no sleepless nights fueled by rage, just life moving forward the way it's supposed to. Trevor turned 18 that August. I still remember standing in the kitchen early that morning, watching him shovel eggs onto his plate like he hadn't eaten in days. 6 feet tall now, broad shoulders, same stubborn expression I used to see in the mirror every morning at his age. "You realize normal people don't eat enough for an entire football team before sunrise, right?" I muttered. Trevor grinned. "Construction metabolism." Pearl laughed softly from the stove. "You two are exactly the same person 20 years apart." Maybe she was right. After breakfast, Trevor disappeared into the garage, and I followed a few minutes later, expecting to find him working on the motorcycle restoration project we'd started together. Instead, I found him standing beside an old cedar chest. One I recognized instantly. Angela's. I frowned slightly. "What's this?" Trevor rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Mom gave it to me last week." The chest looked worn from age, its brass corners scratched and faded. Angela had owned it since before we married. I remembered helping her carry it into our first apartment when we were barely more than kids pretending to be adults. "She said I should have it someday," Trevor explained quietly. I walked closer. "What's inside?" He opened it carefully. Photographs, letters, old birthday cards, scrapbooks. 15 years of memories preserved inside fading paper and dust. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Trevor handed me a photograph. It showed Angela sitting on the hood of my first pickup truck, laughing into the sunlight while I stood beside her holding 2 cheap milkshakes. We looked ridiculously young, broke, happy, before everything became complicated. "She kept all this?" I asked quietly. Trevor nodded. "There's hundreds more." I slowly flipped through the stack. Pictures from Trevor's first birthday, Christmas mornings, camping trips, baseball games, tiny moments I'd forgotten existed. And suddenly, something painful hit me. Angela hadn't faked all of it. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. Because for years, it had been easier believing our marriage was entirely a lie. Easier believing she'd always been manipulative and selfish from the beginning. But life rarely works that cleanly. People change, sometimes slowly, sometimes catastrophically. But that doesn't erase who they once were. "She loved us," Trevor said quietly, almost as if reading my thoughts. I stared at the photograph in my hand. "Yeah," I admitted eventually. "I think she did." Trevor leaned against the workbench. "She still does." The garage fell silent except for distant cicadas humming outside in the summer heat. Then Trevor asked something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you think people deserve second chances?" I looked at him carefully. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether they've actually changed." Trevor nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think Mom changed?" That question stayed with me long after he left the garage. Because honestly, I didn't know. I knew Angela regretted what she'd done. I knew life humbled her in ways wealth and privilege never could. I knew she worked hard now, lived modestly, focused entirely on raising Cora and rebuilding herself piece by piece. But true change is harder to measure than guilt. Anyone can regret consequences. Not everyone becomes better because of them. A week later, I unexpectedly got my answer. It happened during Trevor's graduation party. The backyard overflowed with people that evening. Employees from Atkinson Construction, friends from town, Trevor's teammates laughing near the pool while country music drifted through warm summer air. Pearl moved through the crowd effortlessly, smiling while carrying trays of food toward guests. Watching her still filled me with the kind of quiet peace I once believed no longer existed for me. Then I noticed Angela standing alone near the far edge of the yard. She looked uncomfortable, almost like she expected someone to ask her to leave. Some people still stared. Cedar Falls never forgot scandals, but Angela ignored it. Her attention stayed entirely on Trevor. Watching him laugh, watching him live, watching the young man he'd become despite everything. Eventually, Trevor dragged her into group photos, throwing an arm around her shoulders while she laughed through embarrassed tears. And for the first time in years, I saw genuine happiness on her face. Not performative charm, not manipulation, just a mother proud of her son. Later that night, after most guests left, I found Angela quietly collecting empty cups near the patio. "You don't have to clean," I told her. She gave a small smile. Old habits from the grocery store. I took the trash bag gently from her hands. "You can relax for 5 minutes." Angela hesitated before sitting beside me on the back steps overlooking the yard. The cicadas hummed loudly now beneath the dark summer sky. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then finally she said quietly, "Pearl's good for you." I nodded once. "She is." Angela stared out toward the trees. "You look lighter now." The comment surprised me because she was right. Not happier exactly. Lighter, like I'd finally put down something heavy I carried for too long. "You do too," I admitted carefully. She laughed softly at that. "No, I don't." "You do," I said honestly, "just differently." Angela looked down at her hands. "I spent years chasing the wrong things," she whispered. "Status, attention, excitement." A sad smile crossed her face. "Turns out none of those things keep you warm at night." I stayed silent. She glanced toward the house where Trevor laughed loudly inside with friends. "I almost lost him too," she admitted quietly. "That's what finally broke me." Her voice trembled slightly now. "When Trevor stopped answering my calls after the divorce, I realized I'd become someone my own son couldn't trust." The pain in her expression wasn't self-pity. It was grief. Real grief. "I don't expect forgiveness anymore," she continued softly, "but I wake up every day trying to deserve the pieces of my life I still have left." I looked at her for a long moment beneath the porch lights, and suddenly, I realized something strange. The woman beside me barely resembled the Angela I once hated. Life had stripped away every illusion she used to hide behind. What remained now was flawed, scarred, humbled, human. "You know," I said slowly, "for a long time I wanted to believe you were a monster." Angela lowered her eyes. "That would have made things easier." "Yeah," I admitted. "It would have." A warm breeze drifted across the yard, carrying the scent of cut grass and charcoal from the grill. "But monsters usually don't spend years trying to become better people," I said quietly. Angela's eyes widened slightly. For a second, she looked like she might cry again. Instead, she simply whispered, "Thank you." Not for the money, not for the help with Cora, for seeing her clearly again. And strangely enough, that felt like closure. Not dramatic closure, not cinematic revenge, just two damaged people finally telling the truth after years of lies. Later that night, after Angela left, Pearl found me sitting alone on the patio. "You okay?" she asked gently. I smiled faintly. "Yeah." She studied my face carefully. "You finally let go of the last of it, didn't you?" I looked toward the empty driveway where Angela's old sedan had disappeared minutes earlier. Then I thought about everything that happened since that ultrasound room years ago. The betrayal, the fury, the destruction, the rebuilding, and finally, acceptance. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I finally did." Pearl slipped her hand into mine. Inside the house, Trevor's laughter echoed through open windows while music played softly somewhere in the background. Life. Messy, painful, beautiful. Still moving forward, no matter what anyone survives. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt haunted by the past. Only grateful I lived long enough to heal from it. Autumn arrived early that year. The trees lining Maple Ridge exploded into deep shades of orange and crimson, their leaves scattering across the long driveway like fragments of fire every time the wind picked up. Mornings carried that sharp, cold edge that hinted winter wasn't far behind, and Cedar Falls settled into its usual rhythm. Football games on Friday nights, crowded diners on weekends, smoke curling from chimneys before sunrise. For the first time in nearly a decade, my life felt steady. Not perfect. No life ever is. But steady. The kind of peace that doesn't arrive dramatically. It sneaks in quietly, one ordinary day at a time, until you suddenly realize you haven't carried anger in your chest for months. Trevor had started college 2 hours away that September, studying engineering while helping coach a youth baseball team on weekends. Every Sunday evening he called like clockwork, sometimes to ask advice, sometimes just to talk. Sometimes because, despite becoming a man, part of him still liked hearing his father's voice before another week began. Pearl teased me constantly about it. "You pretend you're annoyed," she laughed one night while folding laundry, "but you practically sprint to your phone every Sunday." "She raised him right," I replied smugly. Pearl threw a sock at me. "I'm talking about you." The house felt different with Trevor gone. Quieter. His bedroom stayed mostly untouched, except for occasional visits home. Baseball trophies still lined the shelves. Old tools remained scattered across the garage workbench, exactly where he left them during summer break. At first, the silence bothered me. Then eventually, it became something softer. Pride. One rainy Thursday evening, I was finishing paperwork in my office when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. "Angela!" I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hey." Her voice sounded nervous. "Hi, Jared. Sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me." A pause, then she exhaled shakily. "I got accepted." "For what?" "State nursing program." That genuinely surprised me. Angela laughed softly, almost disbelieving herself. "I start classes in January." I leaned back slowly in my chair. "Well, damn." She laughed harder at that. "Yeah, that was pretty much my reaction too." And strangely, hearing hope in her voice after so many years of sadness felt good. Not romantic, not nostalgic, just good. "I'm proud of you," I said honestly. Silence filled the line. Then Angela whispered, "Nobody's said that to me in a very long time." The words hit harder than she probably intended, because once upon a time, I used to say it constantly. Back when we were young enough to believe love alone could protect people from becoming strangers. We talked for nearly 20 minutes that night. About school. About Cora starting kindergarten. About Trevor adjusting to college life. Simple things. Normal things. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a while, staring out the office windows as rain rolled down the glass. Pearl eventually appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee. That looked serious. I accepted the mug with a grateful nod. Angela got into nursing school. Pearl smiled immediately. She'll be good at that. You think so? She knows what suffering looks like now, Pearl replied gently. People like that usually make the best nurses. I thought about that long after she went upstairs. Maybe Pearl was right. Pain changes people in terrible ways sometimes. But other times, it teaches compassion no comfortable life ever could. A month later, something happened that reminded me how fragile peace can still be. I received a call from Dr. Harrington's daughter early on a Tuesday morning. Her father had suffered a stroke. By the time I reached the hospital, the old doctor looked smaller somehow, lying beneath white sheets, oxygen tubes running beneath tired eyes that had once carried so much calm certainty. When he saw me enter the room, he managed a weak smile. "Well," he rasped, "you still look too stubborn to die." I laughed, despite the heaviness in my chest. "You taught me well." Dr. Harrington motioned weakly toward the chair beside him. "Sit down, Jared." So I did. For a while we simply talked. About Cedar Falls, about retirement, about Trevor, about how quickly life disappears while you're busy planning it. Then eventually his expression turned more serious. "There's something I've wanted to ask you for years." "What's that?" He looked toward the hospital window thoughtfully before speaking. "When I told you the truth about Angela's pregnancy," he paused carefully, "did you ever hate me for it?" The question caught me completely off guard. "No," I answered immediately. "You changed the direction of my entire life that day," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wondered whether honesty helped you or destroyed you." I sat silently for a moment before answering. "The truth destroyed the life I thought I had," I admitted. Dr. Harrington nodded sadly. "But it also saved me from spending the rest of my life inside a lie." The old doctor's eyes softened. "I've delivered babies for 40 years, he murmured. "And I learned something difficult along the way." "What's that?" "People think doctors save lives with medicine." A faint smile touched his face. "Sometimes we save them by telling painful truths nobody else is brave enough to say." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Because without that conversation years ago, none of this would exist. Not the pain, but not the healing either. Not Pearl, not the stronger relationship with Trevor, not the man I eventually became. Dr. Harrington closed his eyes briefly, exhausted. "You handled it better than most men would have." I thought about that honestly. "No," I said quietly. "I handled it worse than some, better than others." A weak chuckle escaped him. Fair answer. Before leaving, I stood beside his bed for a long moment. "You know," I told him softly, "I used to think strength meant never breaking." The doctor opened his eyes again. "But now?" I smiled faintly. "I think real strength is rebuilding after you do." Dr. Harrington looked at me carefully, then nodded once. "Exactly." He passed away 3 weeks later. The funeral filled nearly every pew in Cedar Falls Community Church. Families he'd cared for over decades came from surrounding towns to pay respects. Mothers carried babies he'd delivered years earlier. Elderly couples cried openly beside photographs of children he'd helped save. A good man, the kind that leaves permanent fingerprints on thousands of lives without ever asking for recognition. After the service, as people gathered outside beneath gray autumn skies, I noticed Angela standing alone near the edge of the cemetery, holding Cora's hand. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowd. No bitterness, no resentment, just shared understanding. Without Dr. Harrington, neither of us would have become who we are now. Angela walked over slowly once most people began leaving. "He really cared about you," she said softly. He cared about all of us. Cora hid shyly behind Angela's coat before finally peeking up at me. She had grown so much since the surgery. Healthier now, stronger. Children have a remarkable way of moving forward, no matter what storms surround them. "Mom says you build giant buildings," Cora said suddenly. I smiled. "Sometimes." Her eyes widened. "Like skyscrapers?" "Not that giant." She thought seriously about that. "I build Lego towers," she announced proudly. Angela laughed quietly. "She's very competitive about them." Cora crossed her arms. "I'm an architect." The confidence in her tiny voice made all three of us laugh. And in that small moment, standing beside a cemetery beneath falling autumn leaves, something inside me settled completely. This was life. Not neat, not simple, not fair, but still capable of becoming beautiful again after unimaginable damage. Later that evening, Pearl and I sat wrapped in blankets on the back porch while cold wind rustled through the trees. "You've been thinking a lot today," she said softly. "Yeah." She rested her head lightly against my shoulder. "About Dr. Harrington?" "About everything." The porch lights glowed warmly against the darkness gathering beyond the yard. "I wasted years believing betrayal was the defining moment of my life," I admitted quietly. Pearl looked up at me. "And now?" I watched leaves drift slowly across the lawn. "Now I think survival was." She smiled gently. "No," she whispered, "not survival." I frowned slightly. "Then what?" Pearl squeezed my hand softly. "Healing." 5 years passed faster than I ever thought possible. One moment, Trevor was a teenager building crooked bookshelves beside me in the garage. The next, he stood in front of hundreds of people wearing a dark blue graduation robe while accepting his engineering degree with honors. I sat beside Pearl in the crowded university auditorium, clapping until my hands hurt. "You're crying," Pearl whispered with a teasing smile. "I'm not crying." "You absolutely are." I wiped at my eyes anyway while Trevor grinned down at us from the stage. For a brief second, I saw every version of him at once. The little boy chasing baseballs across muddy fields. The angry teenager silently processing his mother's betrayal. The young man who somehow survived the collapse of his family without letting it poison his heart. And suddenly, more than anything else, I felt proud. Not because he became successful, because he became kind. That mattered more. After the ceremony, Trevor wrapped both Pearl and me into a hug so tight it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. "You did good, kid," I told him. He laughed. I had decent teachers. The celebration dinner that night brought together nearly everyone who still mattered in our lives. Chuck and Sarah, old friends from Cedar Falls, several project managers from Atkinson Construction. Even Angela came with Cora, now 5 years old and bursting with endless energy. Watching Trevor help his little sister color on the restaurant table while Angela smiled softly nearby felt surreal in ways I still struggled to explain. Life had not erased the past. It had simply grown around it, like trees swallowing old scars in their bark. At some point during dinner, Cora climbed directly into my lap holding a crayon drawing covered in lopsided buildings and stick figures. "That's you," she explained proudly, pointing at the tallest figure. "Why am I giant?" "Because you build giant stuff." Fair enough. The adults laughed while she continued describing her masterpiece with the intense seriousness only children possess. Then suddenly, without warning, she looked up at me and asked, "Are you my dad too?" The entire table went silent. Angela froze instantly. Trevor slowly lowered his glass. Even Pearl looked caught off guard. Cora blinked innocently, unaware she'd just dropped a grenade into the middle of dinner. Angela spoke first, voice tight with panic. "Cora," but I gently raised a hand. It's okay. The little girl looked at me expectantly with wide blue eyes that carried none of the guilt or destruction surrounding the circumstances of her birth. Just curiosity. Children don't understand scandal. They understand love. I chose my next words carefully. I'm not your father, I said softly. You already have one. Cora tilted her head. But he's gone. The table fell quiet again. Because technically, she wasn't wrong. Marcos Jennings still had years left in federal prison, and from everything we'd heard, he'd made almost no effort to contact his daughter. To Cora, he was little more than a photograph and an uncomfortable silence whenever questions became too specific. I brushed a strand of hair gently from her face. But I'll always help take care of you when you need me. Cora considered that seriously for several seconds. Then she smiled. Okay, just like that. Children really are remarkable creatures. No bitterness, no complexity, only acceptance. Angela looked down quickly, blinking away tears. And strangely enough, I understood exactly why. Later that evening, after dinner ended and everyone began leaving, Angela stopped me in the parking lot beneath the glow of yellow streetlights. Jared. I turned. For a moment, she seemed unsure what to say. Then finally, you've become a better man than I deserved. Cold wind moved through the parking lot, tugging lightly at her hair. A younger version of me would have savored hearing those words. Now they only made me sad. We were both different people back then, I replied quietly. Angela gave a weak smile. No, you weren't. That stayed with me longer than she probably realized, because the truth was, she was wrong. I had changed too. Pain changes everyone. The difference is whether you let that pain harden you or deepen you. And there were years when I came dangerously close to becoming someone cruel. Before getting into her car, Angela hesitated one last time. You know, she said softly. For a long time, I thought losing everything was the punishment. She looked toward the restaurant windows where Trevor and Pearl laughed together inside. But it wasn't. I stayed silent. The real punishment, she whispered, was realizing too late what actually mattered. Then she left. And for some reason, watching her drive away no longer felt tragic, just human. That winter, Trevor accepted a position with Atkinson Construction. Watching him walk through our headquarters wearing a hard hat with our company logo nearly broke my brain the first time. You're making me feel old, I muttered during his first site inspection. You are old, he answered immediately. I threatened to fire him on the spot. Chuck laughed so hard he nearly spilled coffee all over the blueprints. But Trevor was good, really good. Not because he was my son, because he earned respect naturally. Workers trusted him. Project managers listened to him. And unlike me at his age, Trevor already understood something that took me decades to learn. Success means nothing if you lose yourself chasing it. One snowy evening near Christmas, Trevor and I stayed late at the office reviewing plans for a new hospital expansion project. Around midnight, he suddenly leaned back in his chair and asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Depends," he smirked. "Do you ever wish none of it happened?" I knew exactly what he meant. The affair, the betrayal, the destruction that followed. For a long moment, I stared through the office windows at snow falling softly over Cedar Falls. Then, finally, I answered honestly. There are parts of it I'll always hate. Trevor nodded quietly. But if none of it happened, I exhaled slowly. You wouldn't have become the person you are now. Neither would I. He looked thoughtful. So you're glad it happened? No, I said firmly. Pain isn't something you should be grateful for. Then what? I looked at my son carefully. I'm grateful we survived it without losing ourselves. The room fell silent except for distant wind rattling softly against the windows. Then Trevor smiled faintly. "You know something?" "What?" "You used to scare the hell out of me after the divorce." I burst out laughing. "Fair." "No, seriously," he continued. "There were days you looked so angry I thought you might actually destroy somebody." The terrifying part? He wasn't wrong. "I almost did," I admitted quietly. Trevor studied me for a moment. "But you didn't." Outside, snow continued drifting across Cedar Falls in slow white waves beneath the streetlights. "No," I said softly, because eventually I realized something important. "What's that?" I leaned back in my chair. "The best revenge isn't destroying people." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "It's building a life so full of peace that the people who hurt you no longer control your happiness." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Trevor nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think Mom finally understands that too." Maybe she did. Maybe all of us finally did. And as I sat there beside my son while snow covered the town outside, I realized something simple but profound. The worst moment of my life had not defined the rest of it. It was only one chapter. Painful, violent, necessary, but still just a chapter. And after all those years, all the betrayal, rage, grief, rebuilding, forgiveness, and healing, the story no longer belonged to the people who broke my heart. It belonged to the people who helped me rebuild it. "Depends," he smirked. "Do you ever wish none of it happened?" I knew exactly what he meant. The affair, the betrayal, the destruction that followed. For a long moment, I stared through the office windows at snow falling softly over Cedar Falls. Then, finally, I answered honestly. "There are parts of it I'll always hate." Trevor nodded quietly. "But if none of it happened," I exhaled slowly, "you wouldn't have become the person you are now. Neither would I." He looked thoughtful. "So you're glad it happened?" "No," I said firmly. "Pain isn't something you should be grateful for." "Then what?" I looked at my son carefully. "I'm grateful we survived it without losing ourselves." The room fell silent except for distant wind rattling softly against the windows. Then Trevor smiled faintly. "You know something?" "What?" "You used to scare the hell out of me after the divorce." I burst out laughing. "Fair." "No, seriously," he continued. "There were days you looked so angry I thought you might actually destroy somebody." The terrifying part? He wasn't wrong. "I almost did," I admitted quietly. Trevor studied me for a moment. "But you didn't." Outside, snow continued drifting across Cedar Falls in slow white waves beneath the streetlights. "No," I said softly, because eventually I realized something important. "What's that?" I leaned back in my chair. "The best revenge isn't destroying people." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "It's building a life so full of peace that the people who hurt you no longer control your happiness." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Trevor nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think Mom finally understands that too." Maybe she did. Maybe all of us finally did. And as I sat there beside my son while snow covered the town outside, I realized something simple but profound. The worst moment of my life had not defined the rest of it. It was only one chapter. Painful, violent, necessary, but still just a chapter. And after all those years, all the betrayal, rage, grief, rebuilding, forgiveness, and healing, the story no longer belonged to the people who broke my heart. It belonged to the people who helped me rebuild it. And strangely enough, she seemed happier. Not glamorous, not envied, but real. Cora reached us breathlessly. "Mom says the hospital opens next week." Trevor nodded proudly. Sure does. She spun dramatically in place, admiring the tower above us. You guys built this? We did. Cora looked genuinely amazed. That's insane. Angela laughed softly. She's been telling everyone at school her brother builds cities. Trevor smirked. Smart kid. The four of us stood there for a moment, beneath the towering building while cold autumn wind swept through the site. And suddenly, the weight of time hit me hard. Because 10 years earlier, I would have believed this moment impossible. Impossible that Angela and I could stand peacefully beside each other again. Impossible that Trevor would grow into this kind of man. Impossible that the child born from betrayal would become someone who felt undeniably part of our strange, rebuilt family. Life has a cruel sense of humor sometimes. The things you think will destroy you forever often become the exact experiences that reshape you into someone wiser. A few weeks later, Cedar Falls Regional officially opened. The ceremony drew politicians, reporters, investors, and half the town. Cameras flashed everywhere while speeches echoed through the massive glass atrium Trevor helped design. I hated public events, always had, but this one felt different. Because unlike the wealth and appearances I used to chase, this project actually mattered. People would live because of this building. Families would heal here. Children would be born here. And somehow, that meant more than every luxury contract I'd ever signed. During the reception afterward, I stepped outside briefly for air. The evening sky glowed dark orange behind the city skyline, while music drifted faintly from inside the hospital lobby. You still disappear during parties. I turned at the sound of Angela's voice. She joined me near the railing overlooking downtown Cedar Falls. Occupational habit, I replied. Angela smiled faintly. You used to disappear because you hated fake conversations. And now? Now I think crowds overwhelm you. She wasn't wrong. Age had sanded down parts of me I once thought permanent. For a while, we stood quietly side by side watching headlights move through distant streets below. Then Angela spoke softly. Do you remember the first apartment we lived in? I laughed immediately. The one with cockroaches? And no air conditioning. And the shower that only worked if you kicked the pipe. Angela covered her mouth, laughing. We were so broke. Painfully broke. But happy, she whispered. The word lingered between us. Happy. I thought about that carefully. We were, I admitted. Angela nodded slowly. I've spent years trying to understand when I lost myself. I stayed silent. At first, I blamed money, then boredom, then selfishness. She looked down at the city lights below. But honestly, I think I just stopped appreciating ordinary things. Cold wind moved gently through her hair. You never did, she added quietly. I frowned slightly. That's not true. It is. Angela looked at me directly now. Even after everything, you still cared about people. Your workers. Trevor. Me. Cora. Her eyes softened painfully. You never stopped being capable of love. Hearing that from her felt strangely heavy, because there were years I absolutely did stop. Years where anger hollowed me out from the inside. But maybe she meant something else. Maybe she meant I eventually found my way back. I made terrible choices, Angela continued softly. But losing you forced me to become someone honest for the first time in my life. The old version of me would have searched for manipulation inside those words. Now I simply heard truth. Not polished, not dramatic, just truth. You know, I said after a while, for years I thought that ultrasound room was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Angela looked over quietly. But it wasn't. What was it then? I smiled faintly. Living half my life believing success mattered more than peace. Tears gathered in her eyes almost immediately, because she understood exactly what I meant. Inside the hospital lobby, Applause suddenly erupted as someone announced Trevor's name over the microphone. Angela laughed softly while wiping at her eyes. "He's waiting for you." I nodded. Before walking back inside, I paused, then looked at her one last time beneath the glow of city lights. "I'm glad you survived it too," I told her quietly. Angela's breath caught slightly, not because she thought we'd reunite. Those chapters were long over, but because after everything we destroyed in each other, kindness still remained, and sometimes that matters more than love. When I returned to the reception hall, Trevor immediately spotted me. "There you are," he called. "They're asking for the founder." I groaned. I hate speeches. "You'll survive." Pearl appeared beside him looking beautiful in dark green evening dress, slipping her hand naturally into mine. "Ready?" I looked around the massive hospital lobby filled with people whose lives had somehow become woven into mine over the years. Trevor, smiling proudly beside the building he helped create. Pearl, grounding me with quiet strength exactly the way she always had. Chuck, laughing too loudly near the catering tables. Cora running circles around exhausted nurses. Angela standing peacefully near the back of the room, no longer trying to be the center of attention. And suddenly, I realized something that nearly brought me to tears. This wasn't the life I originally planned. It was better. Not easier, not cleaner, not free from scars, but real. Finally real. I stepped toward the podium while applause echoed through the towering glass atrium. And for the first time in my entire life, I no longer felt like a man haunted by betrayal. Only a man grateful he lived long enough to heal from it.